August 7th, 1942, 9 a.m., at the humid edge of Guadalcanal's dense jungle, the war in the Pacific shifted its fundamental nature. This was not the quick, sweeping conquest Imperial Japan had envisioned. This was a grinding, agonizing fight for every square yard of choking equatorial hell. For the Japanese soldier, highly trained and indoctrinated in the unwavering philosophy of Bushido, the initial confrontation with American forces brought profound physical discomfort but little ideological surprise. They believed their spirit and their bayonets would ultimately prove superior to the material excess of the Western enemy. Yet, deep within the command structure, and soon permeating down through the ranks, a creeping realization began to take root. A realization rooted not in strategy, but in sheer audible firepower. The Japanese Imperial Army entered the global conflict equipped with a rifle that was, in its design philosophy, a relic of the preceding generation, the Type 99 Arisaka. It was a sturdy, reliable, and powerful bolt-action weapon chambered for the 7.7mm cartridge. The Arisaka was built ruggedly, designed to withstand the brutal conditions of the Asian mainland and the Pacific Islands, requiring minimum maintenance while delivering powerful, accurate shots up to significant range. Its chief strength, its reliability, was simultaneously its fatal weakness in the emerging theater of combined arms combat. The Type 99 required the user to cycle the bolt manually after every single shot, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. A highly skilled marksman could manage perhaps 10 aimed shots per minute. But the doctrine of the Imperial Army did not prioritize volume of fire. It emphasized deliberate accuracy, bayonet charges, and massed volley fire directed by officers. For the Japanese High Command, the Type 99 represented sufficient individual firepower, perfectly complementing their reliance on light machine guns, such as the Type 96 and Type 99 LMGs, to provide necessary suppressing fire. This rifle was the standard issue, the constant companion, the very extension of the infantryman's fighting spirit across thousands of miles of ocean and contested jungle. It was the weapon they trained with, the weapon they expected to carry them to final victory. But as the heavy tropical air over Guadalcanal began to fill not just with the occasional crack of an Arisaka, but with a rhythmic, sustained roar of outgoing fire, a sound alien to the battlefield they had anticipated, Japanese officers quickly realized that the American foot soldier was armed with something entirely different. They were encountering an enemy where every single man seemed to carry a piece of mechanized death, weapons that redefined the very pace and lethality of close quarters fighting. The concept of 10 shots per minute suddenly seemed impossibly slow against the relentless hammering coming from the tree line. The shock was immediate, tactical, and ultimately absolute. The Japanese soldier, accustomed to the slow, precise cycling of their Type 99, was about to face the technological zenith of infantry warfare. The technological imperative driving the M1 Garand began decades earlier, rooted in the stalemate of trench warfare. While the United States entered the First World War relying on the magnificent but antiquated M1903 Springfield boat action rifle, observers noted that the future belonged to firepower, not accuracy achieved at the cost of rate of fire. The infantryman needed to reload faster, fire more frequently, and maintain suppression under duress. The man tasked with achieving this goal was John Cantius Garand, a brilliant but unassuming engineer working for the USS Army at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Garand understood the immense challenge, designing a reliable mechanism that could harness the powerful standard 3006 cartridge, cycle automatically, and withstand the brutal conditions of frontline service, all while remaining simple enough for mass production and maintenance by semi-trained soldiers. Initial designs were fraught with problems. The Army briefly entertained a move to a smaller caliber, the experimental .276 Pedersen, hoping to reduce recoil and mass, but General Douglas MacArthur, then Chief of Staff, intervened, firmly mandating that the new rifle must use the existing .36 ammunition stock. This decision complicated Garand's work significantly, forcing him to perfect a gas-operated system robust enough for the powerful round. After nearly a decade of prototyping, field trials, redesigns, and competition against other inventors, Garand's T3E2 model was finally adopted in January 1936 as the United States rifle, caliber .30 M1. It was revolutionary not just for being semi-automatic, but for its integrated gas system, which tapped propellant gases just before the bullet left the muzzle, using that energy to push an operating rod, eject the spent cartridge, and chamber a new round. The heart of the M1's high rate of fire, however, lay in its distinctive feeding mechanism, the 8-round en-bloc clip. Unlike traditional magazines, the entire clip was loaded directly into the top of the action. Once the last round was fired, the empty clip was automatically ejected with that iconic, unmistakable ping, a sound that signaled both the need for a quick reload and in the heat of battle. A brief moment of vulnerability for the shooter. Despite the 1936 adoption, the rifle was far from ready for the scale of war that loomed. The transition from handcrafted prototype to mass-produced standard weapon required overcoming staggering logistical hurdles. The mechanism was precise. The tolerances were tight. Manufacturing hundreds of thousands of identical rifles, each requiring specialized heat treatment and precision milling, proved a slow process in a nation still scarred by the Great Depression. Springfield Armory served as the primary factory, but the industrial demands of a global war meant production had to be decentralized. In 1941, Winchester, Repeating Arms Company, joined the effort, dramatically accelerating output. Throughout the war years, these factories poured out millions of M1 rifles. By 1945, nearly 4.5 million M1s had been delivered, equipping not just the U.S. Army, but the Marines, ensuring that virtually every American rifleman arriving on any beachhead, from Sicily to Saipan, carried the same formidable rapid-fire weapon. It was this industrial capacity, the ability to produce a technologically complex rifle on such an unimaginable scale, that ultimately defined the American advantage. The M1 Garand was not just a better rifle. It was the physical manifestation of America's ability to turn engineering genius into overwhelming quantity, reshaping the standard equation of infantry combat from a measure of patience to a measure of sustained volume of fire. This rifle was the definitive equalizer against enemy numbers, ensuring that the lone American soldier could effectively challenge multiple adversaries in a firefight. February 10, 1944, in the sterile concrete conference rooms deep beneath the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the primary focus was defense, logistics, and, crucially, the enemy infantrymen. The strategic calculation hinged upon maximizing the defensive advantage offered by the terrain and the unwavering spirit of the Imperial soldier against the predicted deluge of American firepower. Intelligence packets detailing American ground assets were circulated, studied, and often heavily filtered through existing doctrinal biases. The documents, compiled painstakingly by scout missions and analysis of captured materials from the early campaigns in the Solomons and Guadalcanal, clearly referenced the M1 rifle. The terminology used, often translated literally, described a gas-operated 8-round semi-automatic shoulder weapon issued to the American infantryman. The quantification, however, was where the Japanese General Staff failed catastrophically. Major General Tanaka, leaning over a map of Micronesia, tapped the report with a bamboo pointer. He had spent his career perfecting the doctrine of the decisive close-quarters action, valuing the accuracy and simplicity of the bolt-action, Arisaka. The idea that a wealthy nation might equip every single frontline private with a self-loading rapid-fire mechanism seemed frankly hyperbolic. They reasoned that the complexity, maintenance requirements, and sheer cost of mass-producing such a rifle made universal deployment impossible. Historically, automatic weapons were specialized instruments. Machine guns, submachine guns issued only to a handful of elite troops or squad leaders. It stood to reason, based on their own logistical constraints and industrial capacity, that the Americans would follow the same pattern. Perhaps, they conceded, 1 rifle in 10 was semi-automatic, issued for specialized rapid response. The rest, they assumed, would be standard bolt action, Springfields, weapons comparable in rate of fire to the Japanese Type 99. This assumption was the linchpin of their defensive planning. If American fire parity was achievable, If most fire came in measured bolt-operated bursts, then traditional maneuvers like infiltrating at night, utilizing camouflage, and, ultimately, the decisive banzai charge remained valid tactical responses. The Japanese soldiers were trained to withstand initial measured fire and close the distance where morale and bayonet skill would overcome technology. They dismissed the reports of universal issue as standard American propaganda, an attempt to inflate their own industrial image and intimidate the furs. Colonel Kenji Takeda, Chief of Operations Planning for the Central Pacific Sector, famously penned a memo noting that the intelligence was likely distorted by the panic of demoralized American prisoners, exaggerating the enemy's material advantage. It was unthinkable that an army would tolerate the ammunition expenditure required by such a volume of semi-automatic fire. Surely logistics would buckle under the strain, and the rifles themselves would jam in the mud and humidity. They planned for attrition against an enemy firing at perhaps 15 rounds per minute per squad. They did not plan for attrition against an enemy firing 60 to 80 sustained rounds per minute per squad, reloading quickly and efficiently without breaking shoulder position. This fatal miscalculation meant that when the first landing waves hit Tarawa and Kwajalein, the defensive shock wasn't simply the accuracy of the incoming fire, but the ceaseless, overwhelming volume of it, a hailstorm that never seemed to diminish, transforming the American advance into a solid wall of lead. The intelligence officers had been right, but the command structure had been too entrenched in the logic of their own material shortages to believe that America could afford such luxury as standard issue. They expected a firefight. They received an unning cannonade. June 15, 1944, just before sunrise near the cane fields of Charinkanoa, Saipan. Lieutenant Hiroshi Koga led his 12-man observation patrol forward, expecting to make contact with the few scattered American scouts rumored to have bypassed their main defenses during the night. He had briefed his men to expect limited opposition, perhaps a few scattered carbines and the standard rhythm of Western bolt-action rifles, granting them ample time to rush the position between volleys. What they encountered instead was a solid sheet of lead that erupted from the shadows just 70 meters distant. It began without warning, not as an exchange of fire, but as an instantaneous demolition. Koga heard the distinct crack of rifles, sharp and metallic, but they overlapped with such a bewildering lack of cadence that his mind struggled to classify the noise. It sounded like an entire company of heavy machine guns opening up simultaneously, yet the muzzle flashes were low to the ground, scattered across a wide front, the signature of individual infantrymen. Sergeant Tamura, running flank security, took the first volley directly to the chest and fell backward without a sound, his body convulsing even as he hit the muddy ground. Private Ito, attempting to find cover behind a slur palm trunk, screamed once, a high, thin sound instantly swallowed by the continuous, booming roar. Koga threw himself flat, attempting to orient his men, but there was no time for orders, no breath left in the air to shout them. This was not a firefight. A firefight had pauses. It had the predictable lull of reloading, the rhythm that allowed one to breathe, observe, and aim an answering shot. This deluge offered none of those luxuries. The air above them vibrated with incoming rounds, clipping the tall grass and tearing through the lush vegetation with sickening wet smacks. Every 2 or 3 seconds, the distinct, high-pitched ping of empty clips being ejected echoed through the chaos, only to be instantly drowned out by the renewed, relentless 8-round volleys from the same rifles. The patrol was suppressed instantly. They were trained to hold ground, to use every piece of cover, but the density of the fire meant that even lying flat was terrifyingly insufficient. 3 more men were struck down in the first 10 seconds, killed not by skillful individual marksmanship, but by the sheer thermodynamic probability of having a body volume within the continuous storm of steel. The Americans were not maneuvering. They were simply standing their ground and emptying 8-round clip after 8-round clip, leveraging the extraordinary rate of fire provided by their semi-automatic rifles. Koga realized with chilling clarity that this was what the intelligence reports had tried to warn them about, the rifle that required no manual reloading between shots. He saw his remaining men hugging the earth, frozen by the volume, incapable of raising their bolt action. Arisakas to answer the challenge. To stand, to aim, was to guarantee immediate death. They were facing infantrymen, armed not with rifles, but with weapons that functioned more akin to personal, air-cooled machine guns. The devastating efficiency was palpable, reducing their well-trained patrol to a disorganized, shattered heap in less than half a minute. It was a technological demonstration delivered with brutal immediacy, proving that the old rules of infantry engagement, the rules that Japan had built its entire small unit doctrine upon, had been reared obsolete overnight. The initial reports filtering back from the jungle perimeter were confusing, bordering on unbelievable. The few Japanese survivors who made it back to their regimental headquarters spoke not of a firefight, but of being subjected to a continuous storm of lead. They described the sound of the enemy's weapons as a single, terrifying roar, a phenomenon utterly inconsistent with the engagement protocols they had drilled for years. Under interrogation, they struggled to identify the primary threat. They reported the distinct crack of explosives and the chatter of machine guns, yes, but what they could not reconcile was the sheer density of sustained individual weapon fire coming from every direction simultaneously. It simply did not sound like infantry. The senior officers analyzing these combat reports, trained in an era where sustained rapid fire meant crew-served weapons like the heavy Type 92, sought a logical explanation for the volume. They concluded, almost universally, that the American forces must be employing specialized shock troops, perhaps elite raider battalions or engineers, all of whom were disproportionately armed with submachine guns or the air-cooled automatic rifles they occasionally encountered. They dismissed outright the idea that the average frontline American rifleman, the replacement fodder, was himself generating such a high rate of fire. This disastrous miscalculation quickly became intelligence doctrine. It was deemed impossible, logistically prohibitive, and wasteful for an entire Western army to equip its standard combat infantry with what the Japanese viewed as a highly specialized, limited-issue automatic weapon. They convinced themselves that the scattered reports of overwhelming fire were exaggerations born of panic or localized phenomena tied only to the enemy's heavy weapons platoons. Therefore, the Imperial Army continued to prioritize defensive fortifications and offensive tactics designed to neutralize machine gun nests and disrupt traditional American firing lines. They reinforced the necessity of aggressive, close-quarters bayonet charges, believing that such assaults would expose the vulnerability of the supposedly few American automatic riflemen. What they could not anticipate was encountering an entire line of American troops, each man independently capable of firing 8 rounds accurately and rapidly before reloading. The concept of synchronized, large-scale suppressive fire delivered by ordinary privates was alien, and it proved lethal. When a subsequent battalion tried to probe the American lines on Bougainville, they faced a defensive screen that immediately erupted in a wall of gunfire. The American soldiers, employing the mandated fire control discipline taught specifically for the M1 Garand, poured thousands of rounds into the advancing formations in moments, utterly shredding the tightly packed Japanese ranks before they could close the distance. It was the same deadly scenario, now multiplied across an entire battlefield front. The officers commanding that charge radioed back, in despair, not that they were facing an infantry battalion, but that they were under attack by what sounded like an entire battery of anti-aircraft cannons firing horizontally. They were reporting not standard infantry, but a force defined by a volume of fire that defied their very understanding of ground combat logistics. The scale of American industrial superiority was not just visible in tanks or planes, it was held, tragically, in the hands of every single man in the foxhole. February 19, 1944, 3A. MM. Inside a hastily constructed bunker on Enewetok Atoll. Colonel Haruo Sato held the after-action reports for the recent engagement, their pages slick with humidity and stained by countless hours of handling. His face, ordinarily impassive, betrayed the deep frustration of a mathematician confronted by a formula that refused to balance. The logistical calculations simply could not reconcile the rate of fire observed with the standard tables of organization for an American Marine battalion. If the Americans were relying primarily on the M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle, as intelligence suggested was common even in support roles, then these figures were fantasy. But the reality was painted in the bloody detail of his unit's near annihilation. He paced the confines of the earth and timber command post, the dull sound of American bombardment in the distance providing a constant, maddening rhythm. There had to be a technical explanation, a fundamental difference in enemy doctrine that could account for the terrifying hail of lead. Sato knew the Americans possessed the light machine gun known as the Browning Automatic Rifle, or BAR. Its ability to fire 20 rounds of powerful ammunition in a swift burst made it a formidable squad weapon, superior to the aging capabilities of the Imperial Army's Type 96. Japanese doctrine reserved automatic firepower for specific, heavy roles, issued frugally. A typical Japanese platoon rarely fielded more than 2 light machine guns. Sato reasoned that the staggering volume of automatic fire reported must mean the Americans were operating under a wholly different logistical presumption. They could not possibly equip all their riflemen with fully automatic weapons. The waste of ammunition would be unforgivable, the supply chain impossible to maintain, the barrels burning out after only minutes of sustained conflict. He concluded the American superiority was not widespread, but highly concentrated. They were saturating their units with light machine guns. If a standard American squad possessed not 1, but 3, 4, or perhaps even 5 Browning automatic rifles, deploying them effectively as mobile, devastating weapons platforms, then the reports began to make sense. This would explain the continuous chattering streams of fire that overwhelmed Japanese positions, the ability to suppress an entire trench line without the lengthy pause required for bolt-action reloading. The Americans were substituting specialized automatic support for the individual power of the rifleman. They were trading precision rifle fire for sheer suppressing weight. This analysis, while logical within the framework of traditional infantry warfare, was fatally flawed. Sato believed he was facing a massive concentration of light machine guns, when in reality, he was facing the standardized individual rifle of the American infantryman. He was attributing the overwhelming volume to the M1918 BAR, a true automatic weapon, failing entirely to account for the 8-shot semi-automatic volume generated by the M1 Garand rifle, a rifle every single man in the American line carried. He ordered new field directives disseminated immediately. The focus of Japanese counterfire must shift entirely. Every effort was to be made to identify and neutralize the perceived light machine gun nests first. Troops were to bypass standard riflemen and prioritize suppressing the chatter of the BAR. The Americans were relying on these concentrated automatic weapons to win the suppressive war, and if these key weapons could be silenced, the underlying weakness of the presumed bolt-action riflemen would be exposed. Sato believed that by focusing on eliminating these specialized, heavier weapons, they could force the enemy back into the rhythm of manual reloading and standard logistics, a rhythm the Imperial Army was perfectly suited to exploit. His fatal assumption was that the continuous rattle was a specialty, not the norm. He was preparing his men to fight a logistical equation that the Americans had already reared obsolete. The true tragedy lay in the fact that every time his men engaged an enemy position, they were finding not a dedicated machine gunner, but 8 high-velocity projectiles arriving from the muzzle of every single rifle they encountered. And when that clip was empty, the sharp ping of the ejected en bloc clip was not a sign of the assault, but merely the instantaneous herald of another 8 rounds about to scream downrange. August the 5th, 1944, 4003 p.m., near Saint-Lô, Normandy. The constant wet thunder of distant artillery gave way to the sharp, localized sound that defined the American infantryman's day, the metallic signature of the M1 Garand. For the men of the U.S. Army, the M1 wasn't just a rifle, it was an extension of their ability to survive. It was certainly heavy, weighing almost 10 pounds loaded, but that weight felt reassuring when crawling through the hedgerows of France or up the steep slopes of Iwo Jima. It was a rugged mechanism, built to withstand the worst conditions. The fine coral dust of Saipan that choked lesser weapons, or the thick freezing mud of the Ardennes that turned many German automatic rifles into single-shot relics. The American soldier knew he was carrying the deciding edge. When comparing the Garand to the 5-round Mausers or the older bolt-action Springfields that still equipped many Allied and Axis units, The difference wasn't just 3 rounds, it was the ability to deliver accurate, repeated firepower without losing the sight picture or having to cycle a slow bolt. It gave the ordinary rifleman the kind of suppressive capability previously reserved for dedicated light machine gun teams. They learned to trust the rifle implicitly, though they quickly became intimate with its few quirks. Keeping the gas port clean was vital, but more important than maintenance was learning how to reload quickly and fluidly. And then there was the sound. The distinct brassy ping of the en-bloc clip being violently ejected after the final round was chambered and fired. Enemy propaganda, particularly in Europe, often pointed to this sound as a fatal flaw, a moment for the German soldier to rush the now unarmed American. But in practice, the American experience was far different. The rifleman rarely operated alone. The moment one man's Garand pinged empty, his comrade was already covering him, and the noise of continuous fire rarely allowed the enemy to pinpoint which specific weapon was empty. More critically, the psychological effect of the sound worked both ways. The ping was only heard after 8 high-velocity bullets had already torn into the enemy position, frequently eliminating the immediate threat entirely or driving down the heads of those who survived the burst. Furthermore, the enemy had to accurately distinguish between the sound of a truly empty rifle and the sound of an American rifleman deliberately emptying his weapon, knowing he had a fresh loaded clip already clutched in his hand, ready to slam home in under 3 seconds. It created a psychological pressure point. The enemy knew that 8 more rounds were coming almost instantaneously, sometimes before the sound of the ejected metal had even faded into the din of battle. The Garand was loud, it was heavy, and it demanded respect. General Patton famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and the American infantryman, sweating under the weight of his high-tech rifle and its heavy ammunition load, rarely disagreed. The semi-automatic power the M1 provided fundamentally redefined the American way of war, changing the expectations for rifle platoons from maneuvering elements to overwhelming fire bases, capable of shocking the enemy with sheer volume of high-caliber steel. The rifle didn't just win battles, it instilled a quiet, vital confidence in the men who carried it. They knew, regardless of the technological sophistication of the enemy they faced, that their consistent individual rate of fire simply could not be matched. The truth of that realization was laid bare not in battle reports, but under the harsh glare of a single utility lamp in a hastily constructed Japanese intelligence analysis tent near Buna. It was late 1942. A group of senior staff officers, men accustomed to the precise mechanics of the revered, albeit slow, bolt-action Type 99 rifle, gathered around a trophy of war, a battered, mud-caked American rifle retrieved from the corpse of a Marine. This weapon, designated by its American nomenclature as the M1 Garand, was heavy and aesthetically unremarkable, but its internal geometry defied their understanding of standard infantry arms. The chief ordnance officer, Colonel Koga, ran a gloved hand along the sleek enclosed receiver. There was no bulky reciprocating bolt handle requiring the effortful push and pull they had drilled into their own troops. Instead, the mechanism was sealed, mysterious. Koga ordered the rifle disassembled, piece by painstaking piece, using scavenged tools. As the components were spread across the oil-stained canvas, the mechanism revealed its devastating simplicity. A gas port near the muzzle redirected energy from the fired cartridge back down a tube to cycle the action automatically. It was a semi-automatic weapon, capable of firing as fast as the trigger could be pulled. The silence in the tent was heavier than the rifle itself. Their strategy, built on the premise of disciplined, rapid reloading and coordinated massed fire, suddenly seemed dangerously antiquated. Further inspection revealed the unique feeding system, the 8-round en-bloc clip. To the Japanese, accustomed to 5-round scripper clips or small box magazines on their machine guns, 8 rounds available instantly for a single rifleman was an obscene display of excess power. But the true strategic nightmare emerged when captured American documents, maps, and equipment manifests were translated. The M1 was not a specialized weapon issued to sharpshooters or light machine gunners. It was designated Rifle U.S. Caliber 30 M1. It was the standard issue rifle for every frontline American infantryman. Every single private soldier, the lowest rank, carried a weapon that could fire 8 rounds reliably and rapidly before requiring a clip change, far outpacing the sustained rate of fire possible by an entire squad of Japanese riflemen armed with bolt actions. The implications were immediate and terrifying. The Americans had not simply designed a slightly better rifle, they had engineered a fundamental shift in the tactical power of the individual soldier. Suddenly, the strange, overwhelming volume of fire the American jungle patrols could generate, a sound that often resembled an ongoing light machine gun engagement rather than a rifle skirmish, made perfect, dreadful sense. This knowledge filtered up the chain of command, casting a deep shadow over strategic planning in Tokyo. They understood that every frontal assault, every defensive position, and every jungle ambush would now be contested not just by determined men, but by a technological barrier they possessed no means to counter on the personal level. Their infantry doctrine, focused on bayonet charges and relying on moral superiority to overcome numerical deficiencies, was now confronted by a technological superiority that mocked their courage. Japanese leadership had to grapple with the brutal realization that they were equipping their soldiers with the technology of the First World War, while their enemies fielded the armaments of the next. The devastating efficiency of the M1 Garand forced immediate, desperate changes in tactics, emphasizing night raids and infiltration solely to mitigate the enemy's overwhelming daytime firepower advantage. They could not beat the rapid-fire rifle. They could only try to avoid fighting it directly. This weapon was, in effect, transforming the battle space, rearing obsolete the Japanese concept of the close quarters, decisive infantry engagement. The M1 did more than kill soldiers. It killed outdated military philosophy. March 15, 1944, deep within the jungle canopy of Saipan, Sergeant Takeo pressed himself against the damp earth, attempting to track the source of the incessant, unnerving noise. His reconnaissance squad, 8 men strong, had been tasked with locating and neutralizing an advanced American outpost reported to be harassing the eastern flank. They had found the outpost, or at least they had found the perimeter, and now they were utterly paralyzed by it. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet metallic scent of cordite. Takeo's ears, trained over years of service, struggled to reconcile the firing pattern with the assumed weapon. He expected the stuttering, uneven chatter of the American Browning automatic rifle, or the heavy, prolonged rattle of the water-cooled heavy machine gun. Instead, he heard a terrifyingly accurate, rapid sequence of sharp cracks. Boom, 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 boom. A momentary, barely perceptible pause, followed instantly by the metallic ping of ejected steel, and then the cycle began anew. This was not suppression fire. This was controlled, deliberate destruction aimed at anything that moved within a 50-meter arc of the entrenched position. It sounded like 2 or perhaps 3 riflemen firing in tight, coordinated volley, yet the intensity never dropped. Takeo risked raising his head an inch, peering through a curtain of woven ferns. He focused his gaze on the small, sandbagged emplacement 50 meters away. It was not a squad. It was a single, heavily built American rifleman resting the wooden foregrip of his Garand on the parapet. The man was calm, almost bored as he fed clips into his weapon, maintaining a sustained rate of accurate fire that exceeded the capabilities of any standard Japanese light machine gun squad, a crew of 3 men struggling to manage belts and cooling issues. This American required only himself and pockets full of 8-round clips. A private beside Takeo, a fresh replacement from Kyushu, whimpered softly, pulling his Type 99 rifle tighter to his chest. He could not process the volume of fire being delivered by one rifle. The Japanese squad had trained to rely on the Type 96 and Type 99 machine guns for fire superiority, using the infantry rifles only for the final charge. But this American soldier had turned the rifle into a machine gun, one that weighed less, required less maintenance, and never failed to reload cleanly in the tropical muck. The sight was more demoralizing than any artillery barrage. Artillery was random. This was precise and relentless. That single M1 Garand was denying an entire sector to the Emperor's infantry. The rifleman would fire a clip, force the Japanese heads down, reload in less than 2 seconds, and repeat the process, preventing any flanking maneuver, any movement, any effective return fire save for the rare, hopeful shot from a knee mortar. Takeo realized that the technological gap they had read about in vague intelligence reports was not merely an inventory problem, it was a fundamental, qualitative difference in how war was fought. While the Japanese infantry officers still believed in the bayonet charge and the close-quarters duel as the ultimate test of manhood and spirit, the Americans had removed the duel entirely, replacing it with overwhelming, continuous fire. The spirit of the soldier, which the Imperial Army held sacrosanct, was useless against 80 grains of steel moving at 2,800 feet per second. The M1 Garand ensured that the Americans fought at a distance, neutralizing the carefully planned Japanese night infiltration tactics. The rifleman did not need to be a superb shot every time. He simply needed to keep throwing highly effective rounds downrange at a rate that overwhelmed the enemy's capacity to react. Every soldier in the American army was carrying a weapon that functionally outclassed the entire arsenal of a frontline Japanese infantry squad. This was the chilling, unsettling truth that began to circulate through the ranks of the Imperial forces. The individual American soldier, previously underestimated as soft and lacking commitment, possessed a technological edge that transformed him into a self-sufficient, highly destructive fighting unit. He was not required to rely on heavy, cumbersome crew-served weapons for overwhelming firepower. He carried it in his hands. As the sun began to dip below the jungle canopy, casting long, menacing shadows, Takeo quietly ordered his squad to withdraw, cursing the American riflemen. They had not located the position. They had been pinned down by a weapon, not an army, and they were forced to retreat until the deepest darkness offered them their only fleeting chance to move without being instantly vaporized by 8 perfectly aimed rounds. They had learned a terrible lesson. The sound of the M1's clip ejecting was not a moment of respite, but merely the sound of the enemy preparing to kill again. It was a mechanical declaration of superior industrial power, and it echoed across the Pacific Islands like a death knell for the traditions of Imperial Japanese warfare. April 7, 1945, 11:30 p.m. On Kakazu Ridge, Okinawa, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering muzzle blasts of American mortars registering their defensive coordinates. The men of the 9th 6th Infantry Division waited, their fingers resting lightly on the stocks of their M1s, for the inevitable. The Japanese High Command, driven by desperation, had massed thousands of troops for one final, Trimas-coordinated Gyokusai attack, believing the sheer fervor and numbers of a banzai charge could overcome technology under the cover of night. The ridgeline exploded into noise not from artillery, but from human screaming. The first wave of Japanese infantry poured out of the ravines, rushing forward with bayonets fixed and guttural cries of emperor worship ringing across the battlefield. Their tactics were the same tactics employed in Manchuria decades prior: rely on shock, speed, and the belief that the Americans would crumble under the sudden massive rush. But the Americans did not crumble. They unleashed a wall of lead. For the few precious seconds it took a Japanese soldier to fire his bolt, Attrition, Arisaka, cycled the bolt and reacquire his sights. An American rifleman had already delivered 8 perfectly aimed rounds downrange. The air filled not with the scattered cracks of single shots, but with a tearing, continuous roar. The collective, high-velocity output of thousands of semi-automatic weapons firing in unison. The density of fire was unlike anything the Japanese had ever encountered, even in their worst defeats. The M1 Garand, delivering a sustained volume that was easily 5 times that of the enemy's main infantry weapon, simply dissolved the assaulting formations. Men fell so fast, so universally, that the second and third waves stumbled immediately over hundreds of corpses that were still warm, their momentum broken before they had even reached the American wire. Japanese officers watching the unfolding catastrophe from the rear slopes had expected gaps in the American defense periods where men would be reloading or scrambling for cover. They searched desperately for the brief lulls in sound that marked the of a fight. Instead, every few seconds, the familiar distinctive ping of an empty clip ejecting was immediately followed by the renewed, deafening chatter of a freshly loaded rifle. The Americans were maintaining fire superiority not only during the fight, but during the reload process itself, always having a neighbor ready to cover the brief moment of vulnerability. There was no pause. There was no effective counterfire window. The Japanese infantry could not close the distance because the M1 allowed the American line to put more lead on target faster and more accurately than any opposing infantry line in history. Within 90 minutes, the major assault had collapsed into disorganized pockets and panicked retreat, having achieved nothing but massive casualties. The battlefield was soon littered with more than 5,000 Japanese dead, a staggering toll inflicted almost entirely by sustained personal infantry fire. The engagement proved definitively that the era of relying on massed human waves and heroic bayonet charges was utterly over. Faced with the reality that every American soldier carried a mechanical machine capable of outputting the equivalent firepower of an entire Japanese squad equipped with bolt-action rifles, Imperial Japan was forced to radically and often too late abandon their traditions of heroic fervor for the miserable reality of machine-age attrition warfare. From this point forward, large-scale open assaults became rare, replaced by deeply entrenched cave-fighting, suicidal infiltration, and nighttime raids, a desperate tactical shift necessitated solely by the overwhelming, immediate firepower that the M1 Garand brought to the hands of every American GI. The Japanese had been beaten not by American tanks or heavy bombers, but by the relentless technology held in the hands of the common foot soldier. For Major Koji Sato, observing the dwindling effectiveness of his company on Leyte, the realization of this gap was not a sudden shock, but a slow, agonizing calculation of mathematical disparity. His men carried the Type 99 Arisaka, a rifle that was, by the standards of 1930, a technically sound weapon. It was powerful, reliable, and expertly crafted, but it was designed for a different war, one defined by the rhythm of the bolt. 5 rounds loaded by a fixed stripper clip, followed by the requisite physical motion. Fire, pull the bolt back, eject the spent casing, push the bolt forward, chamber a new round. In the open tropical light, Sato had watched the consequences of this rhythm. His men might fire 2, perhaps 3 accurate shots in the time an approaching American squad unleashed 15, 20, or 25 rounds. The Arisaka was a tool for accurate, deliberate engagement. The Garand was a machine for volume, suppression, and panic. The difference between the M1 and the Type 99 was the difference between hunting and fighting. Sato tabulated the true cost of the technological gap. Fire superiority was simply impossible to achieve. Japanese doctrine relied heavily on rapid frontal assaults designed to overwhelm the enemy position before they could establish continuous defensive fire. But in the face of the Garand, any such assault dissolved into chaos almost instantly. The Americans did not have to reload simultaneously. They did not have to drop prone to cycle a bolt. They simply kept firing until the telltale ping of the empty en-bloc clip signaled a brief pause. A pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds before 8 more rounds were ready. This technological chasm meant that the Japanese infantryman, no matter how disciplined or highly motivated, was automatically handicapped the moment he entered a firing range of 300 yards. They could only close that gap through sheer numbers or through the complete surrey of daylight visibility, which explains the relentless move toward desperate banzai charges in the black of night, the only time the physical capabilities of the men might outweigh the capabilities of their weapons. Sato recognized that the Type 99 was not just a bolt-action rifle, it was a symbol of a strategic failure to adapt to modern mechanized logistics. To maintain its high standards of accuracy, the Japanese military had prioritized smaller batch, complex manufacturing, using high-quality steel and expert finishing, which inevitably meant lower production volume and higher cost. The Americans, conversely, had mass-produced the M1 Garand on an industrial scale unheard of in history, prioritizing ruggedness and, critically, semi-automatic capability. The M1 was a weapon built for less war, supplied by limitless factories. The technological gap was further deepened by what the rifle allowed the Japanese soldier not to carry. Because they lacked the semi-automatic rate of fire, they were forced to rely on heavy, cumbersome knee mortars and light machine guns like the Type 99 LMG to achieve even momentary fire superiority. This meant that the average rifleman, carrying his 5-shot Arisaka, rarely carried high-explosive grenades, and often went without sufficient reserve ammunition, relying instead on the specialized support elements that often became casualties first. The M1 Garand, on the other hand, was the support weapon, delivering the required volume of fire from every man in the formation. Sato wrote in a terse, heavily censored report back to headquarters in Manila that the current war was not about territory or manpower, but about industrial throughput measured in pounds of brass and cordite delivered per minute. He stated plainly that for every Japanese rifleman, the combat value was effectively halved in direct engagement against a U.S. rifleman due to the rate of fire deficit alone. This was compounded by the fact that the Americans were also typically better protected by body armor, though rudimentary by today's standards, and always supplied with abundant medical aid and radio communication. The overwhelming disadvantage faced by Sato's units was this simple fact: his enemies did not need to be better marksmen, nor did they need to be braver. They simply needed to pull the trigger 8 times faster. And the moment the Japanese soldier raised his rifle to aim, he was already 8 shots behind. This realization was the cold, hard logic that drove the desperation of the late war Imperial Army. A desperate need to negate distance and time itself because technology had reared traditional infantry combat unwinnable. January 29, 1945, 2 p.m. at Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The report, bound in stark white paper and stamped with multiple layers of restriction, finally reached the desk of Major General Arisue Saiso, Chief of the 2nd Bureau, Intelligence. Initial reports from Guadalcanal had been anecdotal, dismissed as the panic of defeated men facing superior numbers. But by the time the 5th Fleet began assaulting the Central Pacific Islands, the evidence was quantitative and damning. Field commanders were no longer reporting a general lack of firepower. They were detailing specific, repeatable engagement losses where Japanese platoons were suppressed and routed not by machine guns, but by the rifles carried by every single American infantryman. The core message relayed through the naval channels and Army liaison officers was simple and chilling. The Americans did not issue rifles, they issued miniature machine guns to their entire infantry line. For every Japanese soldier capable of firing 1 aimed shot, the American opposite was capable of delivering 8 aimed shots, and doing so without breaking his firing stance to work a bolt. The report stated plainly that this disparity was the primary contributing factor to the unprecedented casualty rates among experienced Japanese non-commissioned officers, who were invariably the first targets eliminated in any close-range engagement. The officers in the Intelligence Bureau debated the technical specifications, Leslie, using charts and diagrams detailing the gas operation and the complex loading mechanism of the M1 Garand. But the strategic implication was unavoidable. Japan's current rifle production focused on the bolt action. Type 99 was utterly obsolete against the primary opponent. It was an industrial defeat codified in wood and steel. The Emperor's most experienced field generals immediately recognized that there was no industrial capacity left in the home islands sufficient to retool their arsenals en masse, produce a comparable weapon before the Americans reached the beaches of Japan itself. They could not outproduce the United States, and now they could not match its firepower on the individual soldier level. This realization catalyzed the desperate strategic shift that defined the rest of the Pacific War. If technological parity was impossible, the Army was forced to abandon any pretense of traditional maneuver warfare. The goal shifted from winning battles to maximizing attrition, to ensuring that the American victory would be so costly in blood that their will to fight would break. The only way to negate the devastating rate of fire of the M1 Garand was to remove the distance over which it was most effective. This dictated the implementation of the deep cave defenses, the refusal to surer ground, and the doctrine of the organized suicidal charge, the banzai attack. These became less acts of spontaneous fanatical bravery and more a cold, calculated attempt to overwhelm the enemy before their riflemen could achieve their 8-to-1 advantage. They needed to get close enough, fast enough, to force a chaotic melee where the enemy's superior technology would be temporarily irrelevant. The M1 Garand fundamentally changed how the Japanese soldier was expected to die.